Amen. So we are honored and delighted to once again have, I say our, Professor Timalsina with us again after so many, many months, a pandemic worth of months. Professor is professor from San Diego State University, and we always just love when he can come to us because he's a wonderful synthesis of both being an erudite and wonderful scholar and teacher, but also a very deep sadhaka as well. And so Professor not only talks the talk, but he walks the walk beautifully too. And so we're always so delighted we can have him with us. I will remind everyone here that as per the instructions of the Board of Trustees of the Vedānta Society of Southern California, that we are under pandemic protocol, so masks must be worn at all times, with the exception of the speaker. So thank you very much. And now, Dr. Timalsina. Sorry, Maharaj, I forgot to give the title of your talk, so I leave that to you.
There's no title. I'm now free.
You were unbound.
You're boundless. Srinathadi Gurutrayam Ganapatim Pichatrayam Bhairavam Siddhaugham Vatukatrayam Padayugam Duti Kramam Mandalam Viram Dashta Chatuskasashti Navakam Viravali Panchakam Sriman Malini Mantraraja Sahitam Vande Gurur Mandalam. I know you are used to listening to the absolute truth. Let me try to share some stories, and none of these stories will have any coherence whatsoever. This is the story of the ocean, the end. So how would that be a story? You will say like, but where is the beginning? Where is the ending? Why I'm starting with this perplexing nature of a story is we grow up as children listening to fairy tales, and fairy tales give us pretty much the meaning of everything we relate to in real life as we grow up. For example, happily ever after, then well, so what? Once upon a time, there's like a time and place for these things to happen. That there is some kind of progression, a linear progression of the events. All the ingredients necessary to weave our everyday experience is already given to us by our parents when sharing fairy tales. And when we grow up, start navigating our life, we want one big fairy tale out of it. Maybe prince and princess and dragons or monster would do it. And a battle, some kind of. When we listen to Vedanta, and now this is the point I have to come to, we are again used to the same pattern. You listen to Vedanta, I also have done the same thing, listen to Vedanta, and then at the end, and what happens after that? We have this burning question, but then after, what happened after that? Events, time, progression, linearity. We are used to listening to Vedanta by discrediting all the premises of the Vedanta. Because our already the framework, our cognitive framework is a fantasy framework, and we want Vedanta to be told in such a way that it fits the framework of a fantasy. And therefore, Vedanta has to make sense at our level. You know, there are two types of people in the world. One, the type that climb to the tree to pick the fruit, and others that just bend the tree, or even worse. We generally like comforting way. Climbing is challenging. It's just a metaphor. So if we can anyway bring the tree to us, that's so much better. Rather than us reaching to the fruit, going up. So when thinking through Vedanta, when Vedanta says Brahman is the only reality, singular as such, we are thinking of this reality in terms of some material, like the clay for making all the pots. We are thinking of this Brahman as the cause for the world to come into being, for the manifold to emerge, because that gives us some kind of progression. From one comes many. It fits our narrative, like father and children. We are the children, Brahman is the father, maybe grandfather. But it has to fit our cognitive framework. And when we talk about the Brahman, and then sometimes we even translate as the God, you know, and then it gives us even more comforting sense that it's a Brahman is going to look after us. When we say this is the absolute pure being as such, there is no spriha, no will, no urge, no tendency, no desire. We cannot relate to that abstract, absolute, because our cognitive framework through which we are trying to map this is faulty. The ocean. I started with the ocean and the end, the story, the ocean. This is the story of the ocean. If you were the ocean and you were asked to describe the tides and the waves and the bubbles, would you, like all the undercurrents, would you describe those as your manifold manifestations? Because from the perspective of the ocean, that is just it. It just is, with or without tides. I never say me and my hands. It's just like, why should the ocean say me and my tides? When I'm moving, when I'm singing, when I'm speaking, I'm me. I'm still myself in all my gestures, through all my expressions. I'm still me. The ocean is still the ocean, with bubbles or no bubbles, with tides or no tides. Why should its singularity be questioned? From the perspective, if I were the ocean and I could describe my own tides, I would not feel that as me becoming many. It's my expression. If I'm running, I'm not being many. I'm just running. I'm in action. From the perspective of the Brahman, the absolute, there never has been any creation. If there never is any creation, there never is any teleology, any purpose, any desire, any need to explain the diversity, any need to explain the war and the disease and the death and the decay, because it's perfect, it has always been perfect, and it always will remain perfect in its fullness. It's replete, undivided, because it's not even undivided as if it could be divided. It's indivisible. From the perspective of Advaita, there is no jati. If the world were to exist, we could say it withdraws. Prapancho yadi vidyeta nivarteta nasamsaya maya matramidam dvaitam advaitam paramarthata. If the prapancha, the manifold, were to ever exist, then we could say it withdraws, and then there is the Brahman, because we like that. I'm just like it say, I started, we need a narrative. And then the world came into being, and then we started seeing it manifold, and then somebody got the jnana, realization, and then we stopped seeing the manifold, and then voila, Brahman, absolutely, oneness got attained, and so can you. It's like he killed the dragon, so can you. We need a narrative. We need a fairy tale. And we are trying to make Advaita Vedanta yet another fairy tale. Vedanta is a pure description. It's not even description when we understand the meaning, because it's just the absolute as it is as such. But when at least we are reading, it's a pure description of the absolute from the perspective of the absolute. And we are trying to derive everything from it. We are trying to explain every mode of life, every event that happens in our life from this absolute. And this oneness of the absolute becomes like the oneness of, like I have one car or one house or something like that, where there's one Brahman. Or we understand this Brahman in the sense of one source. That's mostly our metaphor. I started one source. We all go back to that is the source. We are creating already a difference, because father is not a son. Son is not a father. Don't make that mistake. Father does not transform into the son, and the son does not merge into father when realized. If the Brahman and the world were like the cause and the effect, we would be, understanding maybe, and then we'll say, no, but we are thinking in terms of the soil, like a clay. And then I'll go back to deeper than that. That is also a metaphor. Ultimately, even the terminologies we are used to, the terminologies of Sat, Chit, and Ananda, even these terminologies, we have to call into question if we are sincere to Vedanta. Vedanta doesn't demand anything. I'm like, if we really want to understand what the Advaita is, it's okay to start from analyzing a basic Sat, basic Chit, and basic Ananda. As a student, when they learn the alphabets, this is Ka and that is Ha and all that. But then when they derive meaning, when they recognize the words, when they derive meaning, then they cannot stick to the phonemes. The same way, even the descriptions of the Sat. How do we understand Sat? The being of the chair, of the table, of Sthaneshwar, and of Mr. Johnson, and all those people. All the entities sharing some kind of being. Now we can even go deeper and we explore, is there some kind of being shared by all these beings, the being of beings? And now we are going to a singularity, because that being that brings all the beings within its fold cannot be many. And then that is why we said all that exists has the singular basis of the being that is shared in all the existence by all the existence. Chit, consciousness, manifest in the manifold again in the form of all the names we give, all the words we have to describe our consciousness being expressed through concepts, through fantasies, through dreams, in memories. And all these concepts are soaked with consciousness, just like the same sky permeates the space inside the room, or the thoughts you have, or the big mansions, or the out in the sky outside. We are considering this consciousness as soaking all the concepts, all the constructs. But even these concepts and constructs are not necessarily delimiting consciousness, because we can, just like in the case of being, I ask you to reflect more, go deeper, and go to the being of beings. We go to the base consciousness that allows the unfolding of all the modes of consciousness. And then Ananda, because that is the Vedantic reduction, and Ananda, the bliss. What is this bliss? The bliss, not in the form of the delimited enjoyment, but even in delimited enjoyment. If you read Vidyaranya, for example, Panchadasi, starting from Vishaya Ananda, in these delimited modes of joy, really, let's not make this as a completely outside of everyday experience. In our everyday modes of happiness, in our everyday modes of joy, that is a little bit of a soaking of that joy that brings us closer to our fundamental being. And then we go to, we can apply the same theory. Maybe there is a basis, a foundation undivided or unconditional, not relational to objects, but as the basis, as bliss, as such. And then we can start Vedanta on that platform. And then what type of Vedanta we are going to get is a absolute serene stillness. Is there no action? Action requires agency. Action requires time and space. Is time and space and agency to be conceived outside of this absolute, the totality, the fullness? Then we are fragmenting the absolute. And if this is not the case, then we are rejecting agency and action and time and space all along. Let's go deeper to understand Vedanta. What is listening, hearing? Padmapada, from the perspective of Padmapada, it's just like a sakshatkaraha sravanam. When you hear the Vedanta words, tattvam asi, you are that, you are the Brahman, I am Atma Brahma, this very Atman is the Brahman. What is hearing? What does it mean to hear the words of the Vedanta? Padmapada understood it as sakshatkara, direct apprehension. That is what hearing is. Let me give like a common example. So some of you, let's say, understand Chinese language. And you said something to me in Chinese. I won't hear it. But you kind of repeat to me like 100 times a sentence. I will memorize it. But I won't know because I don't know Chinese language. So what Padmapada is saying is, as long as you do not understand the meaning of the sentence, you haven't heard it. When my friend says, I told Sthaneshwar that I was going to be late, I say, I didn't hear you. But how could you not hear? I told you 10 times. And, oh, you were saying something and into Chinese? Yeah, I told you in Chinese. So would that telling still count as telling me that he's going to be late? That is not a telling, that is like when the listener has not understood the meaning, then the speaker has not said things. That Shravana, the Vedanta Shravana, when we say, let's hear the Vedanta Vakya, Vedanta Shravana, as long as understanding does not occur, we haven't even heard it. This is the absolute perspective. I'm starting from the absolute perspective because that is where my story of the tree, what is the real Vedanta as it is in its absolute form, in its uncompromising form. Vedanta is a pure description of the absolute in its formless, nameless, motionless singularity. And even this singularity is just the word given in our discourse and not as it is. Then we fail to understand it. And then what do? We have to start making Advaita come down to our level. And we start composing all the prayers attributed to Shankaracharya. And if I say maybe this one was not, and then I'll end up offending some people, very painful to have that. Because we are not willing to explore alternative perspective that works for us. We want that perspective that we love so much to come down to our level, so that we could make sense, not the way it is, but the way we want it to be. It's what love does. We love Vedanta. We don't want to understand Vedanta. I'm sorry, maybe I'm in a wrong place. But I'm not accusing her. I'm talking about myself. I wish I want to understand it. I wish this wanting would cease and there would be no more even wanting. I would just be there like Khattar Baba or Mostram Baba, some of the saints I met in my lifetime, who, at least for me, were as enlightened as any enlightenment was possible. Then, in this Nishprapancha, absolute motionless singularity, if we are unable to get to that, and some people say we have to do abhyasa, means practice. Let's practice Vedanta. I mean, how am I supposed to practice it? Let's repeat every day, Tattvamasi, it might work one day. Suppose I forgot I'm wearing my glasses. I don't know if that has ever happened to me, but once in a while I have looked for my glasses, and then looked for here and there. And then finally, oh my gosh, I was wearing the glasses all along and I was looking for it. So, and then let's practice it so that we do not want ever to be fooled that I had been wearing Vedanta glasses all along, and so let me repeat it. I have been wearing glasses, repeat it 10 times. Morning, every day you wake up, I've been wearing my glasses. If you realize you are confused, there's no point of repetition. If you are not willing to realize, no matter of how many times you repeat, it's not going to make a difference. It's not about the quantity of repetition, it's about understanding the meaning and willing to embrace it as it is. If I consider Advaita in this light, because I also wanted to add a little bit from the Trika perspective, so switching the other side of the same coin, rather than going from the perspective of a pure description of the absolute, I would go now from the perspective of the manifold, from the world, from the joy, the fun, our everyday life, our being in the world, our relations in the world, our devotion, our practices, our sadhana. But then, aren't they contradictory? We want a narrative, and then it has to fit in our narrative, because, okay, that is one thing, as if Vedanta described like a picture, and then we want to compare it with something else. And when I say no, Vedanta just is the truth, the absolute as such, and then now people would ask, but then Trika system, if they either it has to be identical to Vedanta, or then if it is not identical, then it has to be false, because how can it be, or there must be two different truths. My response is, from the perspective of the absolute, a pure description of the absolute, Advaita does its job of giving this singularity of the Brahman. From the perspective, it's like a coin having two sides. From the perspective of the world, the manifold, the relations, and sadhana, from the perspective of a practice, Trika Siddhanta gives a path. We want the Vedanta to be the path. But what if Vedanta is the goal? If Vedanta is the absolute? But we want it to be the both. Then call that whole thing Vedanta. It's all right. So for me, this Trika perspective is simply a reiteration of the same absolute from the perspective of the manifold, from the perspective of the words and the meaning, from the perspective of the bubbles or the waves, like you are not the ocean, but seeing from outside, and then the manifold appears. When you are describing from outside, in the manifold appears then. What would it be like? In that Trika perspective, what would be the nature of the absolute then? It's still the same singularity, but then it is vibrant, it's spontaneous, it's free or autonomous, and it's dynamic. And it's in its dynamism, what it does is it constitutes the manifold. It becomes many. Tad aikshata bahusyam prajaye. Ekoham bahusyam. It's in the Upanishads. It assumes the manifold. Assuming is not in the false projection here. It's becoming. It becomes many. How can it be many? Because it can. That is, can is the Shakti. Can is the power. And that power is not something distinct from this very absolute. Just like my energy to come and speak in front of you is not separate from me, or my energy to run or walk or play, not separate from me, my very expression in such and so forms, this very absolute to manifold in the forms of the God and the world and the subjects, the triadic manifestation, or as separating itself, its own consciousness, reflecting back, separating that reflecting mode from the illumination, separating vimarsha from prakasha, and rejoicing bliss as enjoyer, as subject, as agent, and having actions as real, assuming the manifold as they appear. That to me would be a Trika description of the absolute. From this perspective, this spontaneity is intrinsic, inherent nature of being and not separated from the being. And actually this spontaneity is not something as belonging to the being. It is the very being. All that exists is this very spontaneity. Ramakrishna knew that better. That is why he worshipped Kali. Forget all these descriptions. Surrender to the mother. He would say, in her dynamism, in her expression, what is she? Kali, the time. And what is Kali? That time is Swatantra Shakti. There is no difference between spontaneity and temporality. Freedom itself expresses in the form of time. That foundational being manifests in terms of time, and that time unfolds itself in terms of space, and different agencies appear, and then we run our life. What this perspective does is it gives a different sense for the manifold. Every leaf of a single tree is unique, and there never is an exact duplication of anything in nature's creation. We all are unique, even in our physical composition and also in our mind. That is why it is called pratibha. The same spontaneity that is called Kali is also called pratibha, which is also, you can call creativity or intuitive power inherent to being. And this pratibha is timeless and never ever ceasing to be. Therefore, the dynamism is constantly appearing, manifesting, appearing here not in the illusory sense, but appearing in the absolute real sense to become many. This manifold gives us two different perspectives now, and I'll wrap it up. One, the teleology of being, purpose of being. From the absolute perspective of the Advaita, what is the point of life, Swamiji, if the world is not even real? I mean, come on, many of us have asked a question as dumb as that and felt like I trapped this Swami finally, you know. It's like you are already contradicting within that question. Because from the perspective of the absolute, the very issue of life and purpose don't come into being. Neither is there life, and if there is not even a life, because life you are trying to separate from the absolute. There is no life in isolation or separated from the absolute. And then there is no point of going back to, as if you have ever been separated from the Brahman. And if you were separated from the Brahman, what is the point of getting that? It is like finally, I went to meet my dad, and after 5 days, it was too much, and I came back. It will be like Brahman. Finally, I reached the Brahman, and then I was so bored being alone, I just left the Brahman, and man, I ran. And then it can be okay interpretation of the world, like why we are kind of sort of running out of the source, like the galaxy is running out, we are also running out from the source. It's like it could be one interpretation. We are so scared to be merged in this singularity, but there is no merging. From the perspective of the Advaita, there is no merging. Merging requires separation. If there had ever been separation, merging would have been possible. But from the Trika perspective, not that there has been a separation, but there had been an acceptance of difference. I have allowed myself to be different from you, so that I enjoy talking to you. We're having this little fun here. It's a ritual in which I enjoy talking and you enjoy listening. And some who do not enjoy listening don't come. We still continue this. It's a kind of sport for the grown-ups. And we can invent many other sports in the dialogue that requires duality. And that duality is not something non-existent, but not something absolute either. Because I recognize myself to be more meaningful in constituting duality, and I become many. So patischa patnischa abhavat becomes that very absolute splits. It's a metaphor, but it just is a metaphor of the husband and wife in the primordial sense, that it's in the sense of division, because it was divided into half. That is why it is called pati and patni, the splitting. We got the metaphor, but that metaphor is for the primordial dialogue of Shiva and Shakti, patischa patnischa bhavat. And we are living that metaphor in our head. May not be outside, sometimes we even fail to listen to ourselves, when we are having internal dialogue within ourselves, and then we don't listen to ourselves. Forget about others listening to us. But then we have created this reality in this dialogical nature, where language is meaningful, the world is rejoicing, joyous. How can the world ever be joyous? My friend Jeff asked a few days ago, for we see so much suffering. And I'm not going to deny that. In reality, we are suffering. But life is like this. It's a half full glass. Some people only like to see dukkha. Oh my gosh, life is suffering. Others like to see this full part. And life carries happiness. And it also gives us a perspective, though. Do we want to, what if we are fooling ourselves and being happy? If the life was not meant to be happy, and then this Sthaneshwar came and life is, full of happiness. Why can't you be happy? Enjoy a little bit. And then you became happy, and then later realized that all those years you were happy, you found a fake teacher who told you to be happy. I mean, what is wrong with that? Instead of like, life is miserable, be miserable. And then maybe he's telling the truth. But what is the benefit of that? So if the Trika perspective is not the absolute, when it analyzes the world as full of bliss, and let us say after 20 years of your happiness, you realize that I just don't think Trika is very real. I have been happy all my life. These 20 years of listening to Trika, it was in vain. No, it is not. It is worth it, okay? It's worth it. So, and it also gives you a teleology, a perspective of how to live this life in the sense, not just in the hedonistic happiness, but in the happiness where we are capable of caring for each other. Because if you are me split into half, how can I keep you hungry and fill my belly? If that another being is myself split into half, how can I kill him and eat him? Some animals. If I and this world are not completely separated, how can I pretend to be the ruler to exploit these people or be rich at their cost? Sell them the drugs that do not even work and just make them poor, or deprive them of the medicine that I have at stock in abundance. If we were to recognize this singularity again in the manifold, manifestation of the manifold by means of bliss as a pure expression of joy, it does not need to contradict with the absolute not having any manifestation in its pure description in the sense of the Advaita Vedānta. So the final point today is, I think that many saints have found some level, some degree of, if I may, a compromise to live a life through sadhana, and then open oneself to understand the Vedanta as the basis, as the foundation. So as far as sadhana can take us and help us purify our mind, make it able to grasp something as big as the absolute singularity of the Brahman, and then upon that, we can go happily ever after. Because we are always, again, as I said, trying to fit within the narrative that we are so used to. And Vedanta demands that we confront the parameters of the narratives. Trika Siddhanta can work even through our assumed narratives. We can be happy with our little stories. And there is nothing wrong me believing my own significance that makes me feel like a prince in the narrative. It's all right. As long as you are a good prince, you can do something good for the world. And it's a narrative that will give impetus for us to be good. So in that sense, as long as there is agency required, actions needed, we can assume this model. It's about how we live life. We can make these two things work for us like two wings. Birds do not conflict whether the right is the better wing or the left. They know how to navigate through the space by using two wings. We need to learn to live with different perspectives, to accommodate different perspectives in life. One single perspective sometimes works, sometimes may not work. And so we have to have that openness. Thank you so much for listening to me. And if there is another narrative or something you would like to share, I would appreciate that. Yeah.
Professor, I have a question. In the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned that we don't even have to look elsewhere, even in our worldly enjoyment. You say that it is soaked with that fundamental touch of Brahman. But what happens to us? Yes, we feel elated, when we have even something like seeing somebody after a long time, or a reunion between a mother and a child or something. We feel so elated. That joy is so subtle. It's not even, it doesn't even have anything to do with material, but it's like out of love, And then what happens to that worldly joy? Because everybody in this world have felt this joy, but why does not this joy lead us to that enlightenment, what happens to that after?
Yeah, that's really true. And of course, we need to really think upon that question. I mean, scripturally speaking, in the sense the way the books talk about this question, what happens then? Our predispositions, our longing for misery. Oh, no, I want to be happy. No, not really. We are like these little worms that grow inside the toxic plants. There are some plants that are toxic, but they do not die because they grow in the toxic plant and they eat that very toxins, and that is how they sustain their body. That is how we are in our everyday life. Little by little, we are used to enjoying, savoring, being unhappy. When we have the opportunity to be boundlessly happy, we get overwhelmed. We are not as overwhelmed to cry as to laugh. So look at the street. Let's say you see one person, poor lady, she was sobbing into tears. Your heart melts. This poor woman. You also, if you are very emphatic person, you feel like crying alongside her, right? And then another time you see on the street one guy laughing, ha 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 ha. What do? Oh my gosh, that guy is crazy. Let me go to the other side of the street. I don't want to be next to this guy. He's crazy. So we cannot handle happiness. We see someone happy, we think this man is crazy. We can't even imagine somebody could be just happy. We are so used to soaking ourselves into misery, samskaras, predispositions. Unfortunately.
Professor, there's a question from online audience.
Mm-hmm.
So, is the Trika Siddhanta system same as Vedanta practice?
There is no Vedanta practice. I think something got missed. What I mean is Vedanta is a pure description of the absolute. When you are looking for practice Trika system. Because we are trying to, it's like, why do you need to bend the tree when I'm giving you a ladder to climb the tree? We want to make Vedanta as a practice. We want to repeat Aham Brahmasmi and then imagine that one day, I don't understand today, but my friend said something in Chinese and I'm going to continue repeating 108 times every day. One day I'll understand the meaning. You know what? I will die like that. As long as somebody does not actually give me the insight of that language. So rather than trying to make Vedanta a practice, take Vedanta as the absolute description of the truth and practice the Trika. Thank you.
Just a comment. I haven't a question per se, but as everyone, I'm sure, has been asked a lot, what is Vedanta? The easy way out is to say, is to speak of Brahman and what they would understand as God. But after listening to you, it would put a narrative to it in terms of the form, the word, the subject, the manifest otherwise. And yet to try to go backwards and explain that, it's, again, I thought I made it easy for myself by saying Brahman is God. However, now as I see it, as you've explained it so pointedly and specifically, I think I'll just keep my mouth shut.
Silence. He's talking about silence. Yeah, you know, there is. What did they say in Zen? You know, this what is the realization like? It's absolute silence. What is Vedanta? Not like being mute. You know, just because I didn't say anything doesn't mean that gives the distilled knowledge of Vedanta. But if there is no word even in the mind, if there is this serene state, not even serene the way we conceptualize, if there is no language, there is no form, it's like when we give up nama and rupa, when we give up names and forms in totality, what is it like is not a question. So that doesn't mean that we should not encourage more people to come to Vedanta. So what we should tell them is Vedanta is the Upanishads. So Upanishads being a specific section of the Vedas. So they start, let's say Vedanta, and then say Vedanta means the Upanishads. And then, but how do we understand the Upanishads? It's an infinite ways, but ultimately just one thing, right? I mean, all these descriptions are for us, not for that absolute. I mean, the elephant does not know if you call him the god or elephant or whatever. It doesn't matter. The elephant is just the elephant, you know, maybe peacefully listening to you, but maybe looking for some treats, you know. So if you have all the chants for the elephant god, I don't think that's necessarily going to make elephant feel really great about being praised. Oh my gosh, these humans are literally worshiping me. And then the elephant goes proudly tells his, you know, would-be wife, do you know these people are literally worshiping me? I don't think that matters to the elephant. Why should it matter to the absolute Brahman? Even for a dog, you know, if it doesn't matter for the absolute, our descriptions of it being the absolute doesn't matter, I think. But this singularity, all these narratives, I had a little conversation with a theologian, and then he said, I think we can ultimately agree with you, Timalsina, except for we believe in one God and you believe in many gods. I scratched my head and I asked, but how do you count God? I mean, you know, this pointing like putting a number, you know, like when we are saying the singularity of the Brahman or the God, even that singularity is not a numeric sense of a singularity of some substance, you know. So it's therefore we have to go outside of concepts, and that is why I begged all of us, let's try to undo. Maybe the first thing we should do to children is before we tell them any fairy tales, to start teaching them Vedanta, because their thinking would be different. You know, we are so used to fairy tale that we want Vedanta to be fairy tale. But what if we teach them Vedanta, so they want Vedanta to be, the fairy tales also to be Vedanta? It would be the reversing of the cognitive mapping, cognitive mechanism.
So what are the Trika Siddhanta practices?
There are multiple forms of practices. I myself come from Sarva Amnaya. It means there's already a fusion or integration of Trika, Kula, Kaula, Krama, Mahartha. It may be a little bit complex, but what it means is there are these various forms of upayas, means, and in these upayas we have visualizations and meticulous practices of mantras and sustained exercises of the breath to match to correspond to the articulation of the heart. And the mandala rituals, the deity, like even the external images, or drawing the mandala outside, all these, going to temples, everything could come within those. So there is not one practice, there are multiple practices. Even a single worship that we call puja can integrate tens of different modalities happening at the same time. There's a visualization happening, there is a pranayama happening, there's some asanas, physical postures happening, gestures, mudras, articulation, mudras happening. And then I'm visualizing different mandalas. There's a cognitive process of integration where I'm merging, blending different images, reconstituting. It's just like going back and forth, going to oneness, the bindu, the point, the central point of a mandala, coming out to the periphery. So rather than looking for one practice, when we go to teachers, depending on what age we are in or how dedicated we are, they generally prescribe the kind of practice, basically how deep, how intense we want to go. But there are these, like not one or two, there are like millions of practices, and still alive either in the body of the practitioners or some in the form of the texts. Many of these texts are unfortunately not even edited. They are in their manuscript form. 90% of the texts in tantric literature are not even edited, are never printed in the book form. They are still in the manuscript form among the traditional practitioners or in microfilms. So that is the situation. So there are many, many practices. And this is always chosen or decided by the teacher, depending on what particular tendency an aspirant has. Sure.
We'll have a song.
Okay, sure.
Unless there are other questions. Yeah. If you sit, I'll do announcements and then you can meet devotees after.
Sure, thank you.
We can have the adult sport of meeting devotees after.
The truth to be
for announcements today. First, thank you, Professor G, for such a wonderful, wonderful talk. Because of the nature of that talk, it's very hard for me to use words like thought-provoking to describe it, but it was truly, truly wonderful talk. And we ask you, please come again soon if you can, Professor G. Next Saturday, we will have another guest speaker, Revered Karma Lecce Somo, who is a professor of theology and religious studies from USD. She's a really, really wonderful Buddhist nun. And she speaks about once a year as well during non-pandemic times. Her talk will be Silver Linings, Learning from Pandemics. And so all are invited to enjoy that talk either by coming here or remotely via Zoom. And then two other wonderful, I say wonderful announcements, this is my own editorializing as it were. But we've heard from Swami Harinamanandji, our resident Swami, who is at Harvard for a one-year residency program currently. Harinamanandji will be back in San Diego over the Christmas break from I think around December 10th, give or take a day, to January 10th. And so we will be having our Holy Mother Puja then here with Harinamanandji's Pujari. I'll look for announcements of that. And then also we will be having our Christmas Eve program as well. So that's wonderful to know. And so that concludes our announcements. And so I'll ask Professor G for a closing chant.
Taruna Ravi Nivasyam Simha Prishtopavistam Uchabharanamitangim Sarvabhusha Bhiramam Abhayavaradahastam Ekavaktram Trinetram Mada Mudita Mukhabjam Kubjikam Chintayami. I visualize Mother Kubjika, whose face is as bright as the rising sun, who is riding a lion, who is bent slightly with the heavy load of her own breast, decorated with all the possible ornament, and smiling, feeling bliss and blissful gaze. Thank you so much.